Leaked documents have revealed Putin's designs on other European countries, not just Ukraine. We are going to be breaking that down, plus all the news from the front lines. It's February 22nd, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Things are already chaotic because I'm saying all my stuff in the wrong order. This is actually one of the quietest days in terms of frontline changes that we've seen in a while. When we look, we can see that the report is only minor clarifications, which is itself interesting news because, as we know, Bakhmut, Russians achieved this sort of breakthrough outside Yadhine, but then were unable to capitalize on it. Ukrainian forces seem to have stopped them along this line here. And this is significant because it reflects, again, some of the stories that we've heard, that much of Russian combat power has been allocated to the front. There isn't really much of anyone left to exploit breakthroughs like this. And Russia just seems to lack the tactical flexibility to take advantage of favorable situations, right? Ukraine, with its better command and control, is able to plug these gaps in the line. Of course, when we look at the combat map, you can see that there's no reported combat. And while it's possible that all of Russia is taking a sort of refit day and reconstituting some of their attrited forces, I think it's more likely that this is just a reporting error. But still, there's not significant changes to control. But none of this is the real story that we wanted to talk about. The one we wanted to talk about is this: leaked documents obtained by a consortium of investigative journalists show Russia's plans to annex Belarus. The document was written for Putin's presidential administration, their equivalent of the White House. And it describes how Russia plans to incorporate Belarus into a union state with Russia. This is really pretty significant, mostly because one of the statements that Ukrainian forces and especially foreign volunteers in the Ukrainian Legion have said is that they believe that Russia has designs on other European countries, and if they're not stopped in Ukraine, they'll be able to implement them. This document seems to indicate that those thoughts were entirely correct. And I'll tell you, I sort of was skeptical as well. But you remember early in the conflict, there was other leaked documents that indicated that Russian forces may have aspired to take Moldova, another country in Russia's sort of what it believes is its sphere of influence. And the document outlines in granular detail a sort of a policy of creeping annexation across a number of political, economic, cultural domains. And it's worth noting that Belarus is an independent country, but is much smaller than and is heavily influenced by Russia. It's been notable, of course, that Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, you can see his picture right here, has refused to commit his armed forces to fighting in Ukraine, much to the frustration of Putin. And while they do have some significant level of defense cooperation, it's really, I think, pretty important to recognize that Lukashenko and Belarus are an independent polity. They aren't Russian satellites. And unlike in Ukraine, where Russia's strategy involved the use of force, in Belarus, it expects to be able to coerce the country into incorporation. And the document includes a systematic harmonization of Belarusian laws with the Russian Federation, a coordinated foreign and defense policy, trade and economic cooperation that prioritizes Russian interests, and ensuring the predominant influence of the Russian Federation in socio-political, trade, economic, scientific, educational, and cultural information spheres. This is straight out of the Soviet Cold War playbook. One of the things that's an interesting story is that the early Soviet Union aspired to be a diverse polity where linguistic and ethnic subgroups had considerable say in their own affairs and in the affairs of the state. But during the 1930s and the Stalinist era, you saw that rolled back. There became an increasing belief that Russification, or the idea of that Russian language, Russian culture, and Russian priorities were going to take precedence over other linguistic cultural groups, right? This includes cultural groups that exist within the Russian state, like the Yakut or the Chechens. You also, of course, had other states that were explicitly their own states within the USSR, right? It's USSR in English, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Ukraine, for example, was considered an quasi-independent Soviet republic within the Soviet system. And so, but you sort of end up, it's inevitable that when you have these sort of systems where final decision-making authority rests in Moscow, that priorities, not just priorities, but cultural belief systems about the best way to live get universally agreed upon in Moscow and then imposed on these states regardless of whether they want them or not. This is true of both the Soviet system and other independent countries within the Iron Curtain like Poland. And this is sort of how the Soviets ran things, right? They were known to break up or forcibly deport concentrations of ethnic and linguistic minorities. They would often import Russian officials expressly to change the balance of power among ethnic and linguistic groups within a region. Of course, things like being taught the Russian language, being taught less and less about their own history and more about a Soviet history, about a Russian-oriented history. All of these things were part of a Soviet campaign to make non-Russian peoples more Russian. This is, again, partially because Russia believed that its way of life in the Soviet era was the best, and that they were the most enlightened, and that, rural or regional backwaters needed this enlightenment forced on them. You also, of course, had simple a sort of colonial type of system, right? When all the final decision-making authority rests in Moscow, the needs of Muscovites and the needs of the Russian state are going to take precedence over other countries. The biggest and most jarring example is the Holodomor in Ukraine, right? Millions of Ukrainians starved to death in the late 1930s during a famine. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to export millions of tons of grain to other countries overseas. This is because they needed to export the grain to buy other things that the state thought was important. And the state believed that was more important than preventing millions of deaths of their citizens, because Ukrainian interests simply weren't a factor for the Kremlin. And this would be almost certainly the fate of Belarus, right? Where, the incorporation of Belarus into a Belarusian Russian union is almost certainly means that Belarus will become subordinated to Russia. And the Union State, of course, is a threat for the Belarusian people and Belarusian statehood, says a Belarusian opposition leader who lives in exile, who made the mistake of actually running for election in Belarus's last election. Of course, it's a collaboration between Swedish, Polish, German, Ukrainian, and American, and Estonian and London investigative journalists. The document was prepared by a group called the Presidential Directorate for Cross-Border Cooperation, who actually answers to Putin's deputy chief of staff, so a fairly high-level office. Usually, that's too high level to be considered symbolic. The organization focuses on how Russia can exert control and leverage over neighboring countries that Russia believes is it within its sphere of influence, namely post-Soviet countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. And this is, while Belarus is not really a democracy, they are under the dictatorship of Lukashenko, who in turn has some level of connection to Putin. And he is not a good person by any means. The idea that Russia has the right or authority to annex these other countries is preposterous, right? And you can see here in November 2021, this program already seemed to have gotten underway with Putin and Lukashenko signing 28 different integration programs, mainly focused on economic and regulatory questions. They also designed a joint military doctrine, but there were no discussions of fusing the two countries politically. And as we know, Lukashenko very, very much committed to keeping his army out of the Ukraine conflict. Lukashenko continues to, of course, exert his own independence and probably will do so increasingly as Russia's economic and military power gets divided. You're probably going to, or gets attrited down in Ukraine. You're going to see Belarus become more demanding since it's going to be a more developed and stronger militarily relative to Russia. Of course, the strategy of annexation has short-term, mid-term, and long-term strategies across political, military, and defense sectors, humanitarian sector, and trade economy. They are actually say that they want to form pro-Russian sentiments in political and military elites and the population in 2022, and limiting the influence of Belarusian nationalists or pro-Western forces in Belarus. This is pretty predictable. Right? Its victory condition is, of course, the completion of constitutional reform in Belarus that would reflect Russian priorities, many of which have already taken place. Again, an indication that this document is more than just empty writing. In February 2022, the amendments were put to referenda, removing the neutrality of Belarus from its constitutions, and the referendum, of course, passed. Right? By 2025, there would need to be sustainable pro-Russian groups of influence in politics, military, and business, so probably funding their own political party, as well as establishing connections with businesses, major businesses, and the military. Of course, an increased Russian military presence, and a procedure for issuing Russian passports to Belarusian citizens. This is, again, a classic Russian move, sort of like imagine if, China was to sit there and go, hey, even if you were born in the United States, we make it easy for you to get a Chinese passport. It helps build loyalty, emotional loyalty, but also administrative loyalty. And right, handing out passports again to Russian speakers in a region where when the people have never been citizens of Russia, it's a pretty common Russian move. And anyway, you guys can see this is really Putin's reflective of Putin's actual designs on the country. And again, a lot of his statements about this being defensive or an inevitable conflict with the West, and that he wishes he didn't have to invade Ukraine, makes it pretty clear this isn't the case. This is someone with colonial-like ambitions over his neighboring states. Anyway, guys, today we are going to be dropping a Patreon video. I know usually it's on a Friday, but we are going to be taking a look at the full trench video. I think it's like 9 minutes long, and we're going to be breaking the whole thing down. So thanks so much to our Colonel tier patrons, EC1978, Predator 7R, Judith Haynes, all our Lieutenant tier patrons, and all the patrons of Patreon. You guys let me do you guys let me do this, and it means the world to me. And I will see you guys in the next one.